All right, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 3 of Jean Baudrillard's Fatal Strategies. This is titled Ironic Strategies. In this chapter, he's going to focus on the triumph of the object, as well as three evil genies, so to speak, which is basically things to look out for about certain social phenomena, as well as ways in which they can be transgressive against the system itself. Now, a big thing that Baudrillard is trying to counter in this entire work, really all of his corpus in general, is going against this notion of the reality principle or the truth principle, this sort of naive objectivity. He says there is no reality principle nor one of pleasure. There is only a final principle of reconciliation and an infinite one of evil and seduction. So he's basically got two options, one of which is a final principle of reconciliation, which is basically a forestalling of the possibility to change. It is sort of maximum staticness, which he sees more and more as defining our culture. And then on the other end, we have an infinite principle of evil and seduction. This is basically these fatal strategies he's been talking about, which allow for us to continue to undergo change. And the first evil genie he speaks of is the evil genie of the social. And he's basically trying to talk about, okay, well, what is the social? And one of the most important things, which he's really taking from Nietzsche, is he says, neither the morality nor the positive value system of a society makes for progress, but rather its immorality and vice. So, right, this is very similar to Nietzsche's in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, behold their tablets of values, they are their going under. That all of the values and the spaces of transgression are what allow for history to progress. And it's not some rational dialectical progression. It doesn't have a telos, it's not going a specific place. It's, again, this infinite principle. And Baudrillard says the rational systems of morality, value, science, reason command only the linear evolution of societies, their visible history. But the deeper energy that pushes even these things forward comes from elsewhere, from prestige, challenge, from all the seductive or antagonistic impulses, including suicidal ones, which have nothing to do with asocial morality or a morality of history or progress. So he's going against history being rational, like he did in the very first chapter. Instead, what is making societies function is their fundamental irrationality and obscenity. Because one of the things that Baudrillard is trying to point out is that the sort of systems that we have built up, for example, this command to know one's self and find one's true self, or to expand lifespan ad infinitum with technology, this is a way of really denying limits or denying the ambiguity of life ends here and death starts here or whatnot. It's a way of outstripping the essentially obscene parts of society. And Baudrillard is renowned for being a nihilist or cynical. And in response to this, he says, the energy itself is cynical and immoral. No thinker who follows only the logic of his concepts has ever seen further than the end of his nose. You must be cynical or perish, and this, if we may say so, is not immoral. It is the cynicism of the secret order of things. Right, so this secret order of things is basically transgression, which is ahistorical or acausal. It fundamentally is not run by rational principles. Now, he speaks of the energy of vice is irreplaceable precisely because it is an energy of fission and rupture, for which they have very naively wanted to substitute a mechanical energy of reproduction. Right, so we have this insistence on production, which for Baudrillard is going to turn into reproduction of models that are going to be followed and is going to lead to a sort of objectivity of the same. And this underlying energy that Baudrillard speaks of transgression and indeed of seduction and obscenity, that is basically a fission that is always going to stave off the slowing down of the world, so to speak. And to epitomize this mechanical energy of production, he speaks of the United States. And he says that the true motor is the abjection of free enterprise, refractory to any coherent social project. And for me, I really think this is free enterprise as this essentially abstract, cyclical process which we lament as a spectacle, despite it really defining our cultural logic of these, as he says, deeply nourished notions of culture and meaning. And he says that all of the stuff that the US represents, publicity, abject circulation of eurodollars, stock prices, immorality of fashion cycles, etc., all this is not only the historical sign of the domination of capital, but the most decisive proof of a fact more important than capital itself. The proof that no social project worthy of the name has ever really existed. That in the end, no group has ever really conceived itself as social. That is to say, in solidarity with its own rules and coherent in its collective project. In short, there has never been even the shadow nor the embryo of a responsible collective subject, nor even the possibility of an objective of this kind. So, the flow of capital demands reality to be ruled by notions of exchange, of universal exchange under exchange value. And that essentially defines value in an idealist way, of having some reference to some objective sense of value, or we could speak of culture or meaning too, is what Baudrillard is trying to bring out. And this means that society is run by outpacing its own project constantly. And as such, there really is no real social in the sense of some collective subject of the people, so to speak, which runs society. In fact, society runs precisely by always outpacing this idea of the social. And the fact that we feel as if we've never been represented, or at least today we haven't been represented, but back in the day we were represented in politics or in society or in the media. Baudrillard is trying to point out that the fact that that representation feels lacking is precisely because there is no idealized subject behind all this. He says, if our perversion lies in this, that we never desire the real event but its spectacle, never things but their sign, and the secret derision of their sign, it means that we don't really want things to change. The change must also seduce us. Right? So effective change or subversion needn't and indeed shouldn't be romanticized or obvert or objective. Baudrillard wants it to be subtle, like a crafty joke. He says it is this cunning impulse that delivers us from terror. That's right. It's trying to bring out ambiguity in systems. And he says, does not this secret disobedience of a group to its own principles, this profound immorality and duplicity, reflect a universal order? We need to reawaken the principle of evil active in Manichaeanism and all the great mythologies in order to affirm against the principle of good, with a capital G, not exactly the supremacy of evil, with a capital E, but the fundamental duplicity that demands that any order exists only to be disobeyed, attacked, exceeded, and dismantled. And here Baudrillard is insisting on something that a lot of the French postmodernists, as well as really I think we can see this starting most overtly with Nietzsche, of transgression, that all of the openings or the ambiguities in society are for the purpose of being a going under, as Nietzsche calls it, a transgressive activity, which is essentially going to focus on the duplicity of the state I'm in now and the future. And the future is not some deterministic place set out. And Baudrillard says, in order for something to come alive, the God who incarnates it has to die. That is the basic rule. For a group or an individual to live, it can never aim at its own good, its own interest, its own ideal. It always has to aim elsewhere, to the side, beyond, off-center, like the combatant in the Japanese martial arts. It is useless to attempt to reconcile these two principles. Duplicity is strategic and fatal. And really what we're getting at here is forsaking ideals and learning not to reconcile, but to subvert and perversify, rather than combining the real with some ideal to which we are going, which really, this would be Nietzsche's last man. This would be the total staving off of the possibility for change. Rather, we take the real to the nth degree using signs, using pataphysics, the science of imaginary solutions, as Baudrillard calls it. And what we're doing is, in order to live, we are not apprehending the rules of the system and then going contra those rules. This would be like the person who, in response to the perversity of the media today or the insistence on working, just turns into kind of an escapist and goes and lives in the woods to try to get back to their true selves, back to the natural before we were perverted by information or technology. Like, no, really that is a false conclusion for Baudrillard. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that is prompted by the system, especially when Baudrillard speaks of the answer being solicited by the question in like a poll, for example. That is precisely the kind of thing that the system treats as a way out, that in fact makes society itself run. This sort of, oh, if I keep working, I will get to this ideal state where I'm happy. Instead, Baudrillard wants us to do something which is subversive, but it is not negative. We are not negating the rules, but rather we are aiming elsewhere, as he says. And elsewhere is important because that is an ambiguous direction. He speaks of it as being off-center. So when we're aiming, so to speak, when we're drawing our lines of flight, to use a Deleuzian term, we're keeping in mind where that center is, where we're being pulled, but we're just aiming a little off-center. We're doing something perverse, something subversive, which aims at a sort of duplicity that sometimes the system can't handle. And he speaks of this as a risky, precarious organization, possibly even absurd, a project of devastating energy, an anti-economy, a prodigy, a challenge to conservative nature. And when it comes to power, I think Baudrillard's musings on power are really interesting. He says, of course people choose leaders and obey them. Of course they invest their representatives with power and legitimacy. But can we suppose that there doesn't always remain the logical necessity to take vengeance on them? Power, whatever it is and wherever it comes from, is a symbolic murder, and it must be expiated by murder. And really this bears a lot of similarity to what he intimated in Symbolic Exchange and Death, which is that any good system knows how to create binaries that make the other basically feel like they have some power, but in fact it's It's merely a derivative power, or it's a solicited power, which lulls one into submission. So when power seems to be the least powerful, when it seems like they're the least representative, for example, like Trump. I mean, Trump is quite an impotent caricature, and he really doesn't represent his voting bloc, right? He speaks about, working for the people and everything, but I mean, Trump's style of work is very different from the style of work of the people who vote for him. At these moments, that is when its circulation has been achieved. That is when power is truly able to circulate, is when it pings back and forth between the Democrat-Republican binary, which is in fact, I mean, if anyone knows anything about U.S. politics, you will know that both of our main parties, which are really the only parties today, are really both right-leaning parties. There's kind of a pseudo left versus right dialectical kind of Goethe-Dämmerung going on, but really it's not that at all. And he says, power, like truth, is the empty place you must know how never to occupy, but that you must know how to produce so that others will be swallowed up in it. On the other hand, power that insists on occupying this place, power that incarnates power, is obscene and impure, and sooner or later it collapses amidst blood and ridicule. So, right, all political orders will fall away at some point. There is no eternal, like Roman Empire, kind of that just doesn't work. Even under the most severe constraints, that doesn't really work. But what does work is setting up a situation such that power solicits its opposition to oppose and destroy it. And by doing so, we essentially create a cyclical system. And Baudrillard says, furthermore, a strategy of intelligent subversion would also be to avoid aiming directly at power, but rather to force it into occupying this obscene position of absolute obviousness. For it is there that, mistaking itself for real, it falls into the imaginary. It's there that it no longer exists except to violate its own secret. So, right, again, we have that idea of aiming a little bit off center. First off, like Baudrillard has mentioned, power at its apex is its most diffuse moment. It is not some hierarchical up and down, oh, it's a point up there. We feel like it's a point up there, but that's exactly because it is invested society itself. So rather, if we want to subvert power, we have to banalize power through its obviousness, accentuate its symbolic register or space. And by putting it in that space, then you can work on it. Baudrillard, because, you might read this and you might be like, oh, well, this is not really a good way of working out solutions. It seems so purely conceptual. It seems like it's disobeying all like real struggle. Baudrillard says, simulation is always the most effective weapon. It's enough to annihilate yourself in front of what opposes you to oblige that force to turn against itself with all the power of its inertia. May 68, therefore, was not an offensive weapon. Power would win that battle hands down, but a defensive simulation, which is to rob power of its own secret, precisely that it doesn't exist, and so to leave it defenseless before its own enormity. So, right, he's painting kind of a ironic caricature of May 68 of, oh, it was basically this flailing of the arms which brought out the obviousness of the state's impotence, of all these college kids basically running around and getting shit done for a short amount of time. And really we have kind of the notion that Baudrillard loves to play on, which is that if you merely elicit a reaction that can't get an adequate response, that is really what Baudrillard calls the objective irony of evil. These are those fatal strategies that he's talking about. Now, in the evil genie of the object, which is the second evil genie that he's talking about, he's really aimed against natural science, particularly physics, which he sees as basically an aleatory phenomenon, which aims at looking at things through an essentially symbolic register and parading it as the real, quote unquote, that it's essentially stuck in a paradigm. He speaks of an object condemned to total simulation, that is to say, projected into the aleatory form of models. And he goes on to say that the hypothesis is never entertained beyond an object's being distorted, of its active reply to the fact of being questioned, solicited, and violated. And he's saying this in response to some discoveries in quantum physics, one of which being the observation of a quantum particle without being observed. A quantum particle is essentially in an ambiguous state, and it has a wave function which defines its possibility for being defined at any one locus at any one point in time. And when observed, the exchange of photons collapses that wave function, and the quantum particle can be found at a point. And of course, this is why he's saying that there's an active reply to the fact of being questioned, solicited, violated. That the mere probing of something elicits a particular type of answer. And this might sound very benign, but in fact this is going to play in a lot to Baudrillard's notion, or rather criticism of the notion, that one can get to some sort of outside. This would be like those modern appeals to like grassroots nature, like, again, I'll go into the forest, or I'll join a community who can get back to our roots. This is a desire which Baudrillard sees as being coded within society. It is precisely the sort of escape that we are allowed to feel like we ought to take. And in fact, this desire speaks not so much to some ideal outside space of perfection, of non-alienation, but rather speaks to the way society codes us, to the way that we exist in certain models. And thus, the existence of a paradigm for Baudrillard really disallows the possibility for an outside, because the passage to that outside is always going to be guided such that one essentially remains inside. And Baudrillard is not lamenting this. He's not trying to get to some ideal, perfect utopian state where we have all our desires realized, where we get back to our roots, where we can finally understand each other. But Baudrillard is not saying that. That's not a possibility for Baudrillard. He's precisely saying that the reason we have so many troubles in society is this insistence on meaning, on identity, on objectivity, on the notion that reality is an obvious principle today, that we know what's real, for example. And because we live in this sort of situation, we can basically have that reality principle pulled out of us through media, through things like TV. So in fact, there is an actively solicited reply merely due to the act of being acted upon. And another look at quantum mechanics points out a number of qualities. Baudrillard speaks of, and he doesn't explicitly state the physics terms, but he's talking about quantum indeterminacy, and entanglement. So quantum indeterminacy is what I spoke about before. that prior to observation, quantum particles are essentially random within a generalized space. They have kind of an approximate space where they can be found. But prior to observation, they are really in multiple different spaces at the same time. Or what would be more precise to say is not that they exist completely in any one space at any time, but rather that they convey a radical ambiguity. And this is something that is plaguing modern science today is I've heard this said before by Sean Carroll, who's a famous theoretical physicist, that modern theoretical physics is basically philosophy, because we've really gotten to a hermeneutical question of, well, how do we interpret this model of quantum mechanics? We have tons of different models for how to interpret the quantum data that we have received. And this is a whole new way of doing physics, which really is butting up against this problem of innocent objectivity. And the second physics phenomenon that he's speaking of is quantum entanglement. And I'll just quote, he doesn't actually cite who this quote is from, which is frustrating with Baudrillard too, but it is what it is. I quote, "A measurement propagates its long-range effects at a speed greater than that of light. The photons awaken each other, send information back to the light source, and think up ways to avoid the disturbance caused by the system of observation. The photons communicate. It's fantastic. And to do so, it seems that they employ instantaneous interactions at a distance, beyond the limit of the speed of light. Energy coming from the future could modify the present state of the system." And I realize it still might be a little ambiguous what exactly this phenomenon is. So quantum particles exhibit a property called entanglement, which is, we really don't understand it very well today, and I even less than the theoretical physicists, of course. I'm not trying to claim some sort of omniscience with regards to this topic. But quantum particles can be entangled in groups of two, where the observation of one allows, at an instant, with no delay, two particles who are both quantum for both of their wave functions to collapse at the same time. So there's an interaction between entangled particles which allows for a change of state to occur faster than the speed of light in terms of traveling between two quantum particles. And Baudrillard's pointing all of these out precisely to point at how we are at a limit of this sort of naive objectivity, and how when we insist on these ideal notions of logic or rationality behind the rules of the universe, really what we're doing is we're pushing it into some idealized representational world of this is how it ought to be, or this is what is easy for us. Baudrillard says, when you think about it, it is fantastically obvious. It is the scientific hypothesis of the dead objectivity of the universe that is implausible. If one wishes to be a materialist, one should by no means attribute to matter this inertia and passivity, but instead a genie, even an evil one, able to undo all attempts to subjugate him. That's right. He's kind of personifying this, right? These quantum particles really is what he's looking at in particular here. But it's nature's radical insistence on not being governed, on not being reduced to some sort of idealized notion. And as a result of this, he says that what we should do is anticipate the desire of the other, reflect his demand like a mirror, satisfy it in advance. We can scarcely imagine what power of deception and absorption, entrapment and diversion, in a word, of subtle revenge, there is in this instantaneous seduction. Right? So seduction is not bound by limits of a certain speed. right? Ideas don't travel at a speed. Think about how you can link concepts and ideas in your head, and they don't follow some temporal succession. They can all coalesce within this ambiguous space within the mind, to use the least charged possible term, and gives us the possibility to work with symbolic concepts. And we can play with the symbolism, and in so doing, elicit some kind of change. And Baudrillard says the light from a television, it has been pointed out, is endogenous. It comes from within and reflects nothing. Everything happens entirely as if the screen itself were the cause and origin of the phenomena that appear there. So serious are the consequences of the current sophistication of the system of quote-unquote objective capture that they have annihilated the very objectivity of their processes. And this is really how simulacrums work in general. Information itself is endogenous. And this is what Baudrillard is trying to point out, that really information is hyper-real. It is realer than real, so to speak. It is produced spontaneously in this instantaneous obscenity, is probably what Baudrillard would call it. It is produced ad hoc, yet ex nihilo. So it is acausal, right? Concepts are not bound by causal relationship to one another. They can coagulate in all sorts of forms. And really we can see this when we think about the sort of empty, simulacral, endogenous concepts we have. We have things like the people, or the populace, or freedom, or democracy, which no matter what country you look at, but especially in the US where those sort of are flailed around as if we embodied them, which we don't, when we do that, we can basically use these principles to stitch together any situation. Some sort of oil spill happened, we can somehow use these concepts to clean it up. Some sort of war is happening somewhere else, we can use these concepts to force ourselves into that. There's oil somewhere that we want, we can use the idea of freedom and democracy, and we can, for example, prop up terrorists in the Middle East in order to act as a precedent. So, right, these concepts radiate their own truth, and they don't reflect anything. They don't need to. They're merely a conjunction of signs. So they're ad hoc, and they're basically circumstantial, and yet the truth of them seems to come out of nowhere. But Baudrillard says, one may see that the disappearance itself can also be a strategy, not a necessary consequence of the information system, but a strategy proper to the object, for which the monitor screen would serve somehow as a screen of disappearance. So, right, he's playing on this ambiguity of disappearance, which can allow for the disappearance and strategic subversion of fatal strategies themselves. And I love how Baudrillard talks about this desire to record, to account for everything, and maybe this is why Baudrillard doesn't provide citations sometimes, is that it doesn't matter where it's from. And he can use this in sometimes funny ways, such as the famous Ecclesiastes quote at the beginning of Simulacra and Simulation, which is not from Ecclesiastes. I remember I had read Ecclesiastes like the day before I had read Simulacra and Simulation, which was Baudrillard's first book. And I read that and I was like, I don't remember that. And I looked it up and it was like, no, it's a false quote. And I was like, why would he do that? But this is exactly what he's doing. That he's going against this notion that everything has to be recorded, everything has to have some sort of meaning, has to be held accountable, has to be objective, has to be real. He says, we record everything, But we don't believe it because we have become screens ourselves. And who can ask of a screen to believe what it records? To simulation, we reply by simulation. We have ourselves become systems of simulation. There are people today, the polls tell us so, who don't even believe in the space shuttle. Here it is no longer a matter of philosophical doubt as to being and appearance, but a profound indifference to the reality principle as an effect of the loss of all illusion. All the old structures of knowledge, the concept, the scene, the mirror, attempt to create illusions, and thus they emphasize a truthful projection of the world. Electronic surfaces, on the other hand, are without illusion. They offer only the inconclusive. And right now we're getting into the idea of polls and of our desire for information, our desire to predict and thus optimize society. That when we do this, we essentially create merely a sense of ambiguity, of inconclusivity, of perpetuating the purely real. This is what Baudrillard means by the desert of the real in Simulacra and Simulation. That because everything has to be transparently true or real, this is the reality principle, we essentially have a system of infinite reproduction in which it no longer makes sense to speak of the real as if it had some reference to an outside, but rather we can only speak of hyper-reality, of reality as a solicited response to an original reality that doesn't exist, as a solicited response to some sort of idealist concept of the truth or meaning or value or true living or true love or true desire. He says, but we cannot say in order to denounce something, it's only TV, because there's no longer a universe of reference, because illusion is dead or because it is total. The day we will be able to say it's only TV, it's only information, will be the day when everything will have changed. And really, this is hyper-reality. It's ambiguous, it's inconclusive. We can see something on TV and it produces real effects as if we were right there. It's like when Baudrillard mentioned that the announcing of a nuclear disaster would produce more social disruption than would the nuclear bomb. Because for Baudrillard, the difference between illusion being dead and illusion being total is basically the same thing in a simulacrum. You either have, illusion is dead because everything is transparent, everything is objective, everything is forced to be real, asked to make itself known. But by doing that, everything is basically some sort of surface level reproduced, essentially elusive object. And thus, Baudrillard is really trying to get us away from this notion of representation. He says a screen, whether TV or a survey, represents nothing. It's a mistake to think that polls can be representative of anything at all, as a word can be of a thing, an image of a reality, or a face of inner feelings. So it's not a question of representing, but using the notion of representing, of, our government is really representing the people, so to speak. Using these abstract terms as the aegis for a reproductive, consumer sort of way of living. So he says, we should therefore believe neither those who exalt the beneficial use of the media, nor those who complain about manipulation, for the simple reason that there is nothing in common between a system of meaning and a system of simulation. Advertising and polls are quite incapable of alienating the will or the opinion of anyone, for the simple reason that they don't operate in this space-time of will and representation where judgment is formed. For the same reason, it's quite impossible for them to shed any light on anyone's will or opinion, since they are foreign to the scene of opinion, at once theatrical and representative, that constituted the very scene of politics. So we may rest assured that they cannot possibly destroy this scene, but let us not have any illusions about them either. They have nothing to teach us. So, right, media is not representational, it's simulacral. There is no people as an idealized subject that really exists behind the simulacra that are going to give us some sort of recourse. That would be too conservative of a notion for Baudrillard. And in fact, that would lead to the sort of populist rhetoric we see today, where Trump can say, "Make America great again," and can refer to some idealized point in America, which never really existed. It's a purely, just a simple look at history. It would be completely unnuanced to take a look at America like that at any point in time. It would never fall to these ideals that Trump claims have been subverted today. This populist conservative rhetoric is the result of the appeal to representations, to people's will or opinion, as if they had a will or opinion that was self-sufficient. That's precisely the point of many of these postmodernists is, look, you're not an innocent subject. In fact, Baudrillard is trying to point out that you essentially become a perpetuated object in a system of symbolic exchange, and that place of symbolic exchange is our possible space for fatal strategies, but it's also our space for subjectification. And Baudrillard says that the screen that media information weaves around us is a screen of total uncertainty, and of totally new uncertainty, since it is no longer the kind that results from a lack of information, but one that comes from information itself, from an excess of information. Unlike traditional uncertainty, which could always be resolved, this one is irreparable and therefore will never be lifted. Such is our destiny as the polled, the informed, the measured. Confronted with the anticipated verification of our behavior, absorbed by this permanent refraction, we are never again confronted with our own will or with that of the other. We are no longer even alienated, for there is no more other. The scene of the other, like that of the social and political, has disappeared. Each individual is forced into the undivided coherence of statistics, extroversion without appeal, like uncertainty. So Baudrillard, again, is getting away from that transcendent other, which gives us a transcendent sense of certainty, of a real self, of a real will, of a real outside. Instead, it is what Baudrillard calls an exoteric phenomenon of just pure expanse based on arbitrary and abstract principles, which we are lulled into thinking we are getting outside of, when in actuality they are what define us. And he says that the obscenity of polls is from what he calls statistical exhibitionism, from this continual voyeurism of the group spying on itself. At every moment, it must know what it wants, what it thinks. It must see itself in numbers on the video screen, decipher its temperature curves in a sort of hypochondriacal mania. The social is obsessed with itself. It becomes its own vice, its own perversion. Over-informed, it becomes obese with itself. And really, this is a sort of getting drunk on the real, so to speak, getting intoxicated by the real, or lulled by the real, which is essentially a circular subjection of transparency, of desire and identity. It's, I must have some definite wants, ideas that I hold. I must be accountable to a certain group. I must be responsible for everything. All of these, by fixing on some authentic self or voice, we ensure ultimate silence and being static. This is what Baudrillard means by cryogenesis, by the way, that he uses throughout the work. And he says, all of this would be dramatic if there was an objective truth of needs, an objective truth of public opinion. The influence of advertising, polls, media, information, the pollution of consciousness. All this would be dramatic if we were certain that there existed a human nature and social essence somewhere with their own values and will. For that would pose the eternal problem of alienation. And I added in those emphases myself. But the point is that this sort of worrying that he's embodying, this is the conservative worrying of getting back to our roots, of some objective truth of what society really wants. In fact, no, Baudrillard, the way society is invested, it's not too far off from Deleuze and Guattari's idea of desiring production. That, for example, people weren't lulled or faked in Germany in the 1930s and 40s into being blind to what Hitler was doing. No, the far more interesting and disconcerting question is, how did they grow to actively desire or consent to what was going on? Desire is something that is constituting the populace. And of course, we can look at, just reading Mein Kampf is interesting just for this, just to see, okay, what were the kind of things that would have been appealing, that would have, Germany is in complete destruction at this point in terms of the outcomes of World War I, for example. So it's very understandable the sort of troubles that are arising. We've got tremendous inflation occurring. We have reparations which are being forced to be paid on Germany's part, which it could not pay. They were absolutely egregious. I'm not saying they weren't deserved, but they were absolutely egregious. That something had to be done. And it's in that something could be or needs to be done that desiring production can work its magic and cause some sort of obscene thing like Hitler to come about. And how this happens is not by being lulled or being tricked, but by constructing public opinion, by constructing through the media, through newspapers, for example, and anti-Semitic pamphlets, through using these social instruments to conjure up the social itself. This is what Baudrillard means by becoming obese with itself. The very instruments of sociality constitute sociality. And Baudrillard wants to point out that there is really a triumph of the object which defines modern or contemporary society. He says, the object is never innocent. It exists and takes revenge. The flawed refraction of the luminous ray of information on the matter of the social is neither an accident nor an imperfection in the system. It comes from the genie of the object, from an offensive resistance of the social to its investigation, and which takes the form of an occult duel between master pollsters and the polled, between the masses and the political class, etc. So really what he's trying to say here is just that our delirium stems from our essentially thrown insistence on objectivity, as if that eliminated the ambiguity of power or the object. It's this sort of naivete about objects, which is the moment at which we can be turned into objects. It's that, objects are over there and I reproduce them, but my labor is being exploited and therefore I'm being alienated and therefore I am being turned into an object. But no, Precisely the objectifying of other things in the sense of making objects or making things objects. This sort of consumer and productive based society acts on oneself. This is like when Deleuze and Guattari say in A Thousand Plateaus, there are no individual statements. There never were. There are only collective assemblages of enunciation. That what something means, how it interacts, especially like on a symbolic level for Baudrillard, is tied up in a fact of objects not being innocent, that they exist in an ambiguous state which allows for the possibility to extrapolate fatal strategies from them. And Baudrillard mentions really what I am calling pole societies. He says, a game of equal finality of all tendencies, effects of truth, and of the circularity of questions and answers, etc. Are we perhaps all thereby inaugurating a collective form of ironic existence that, in its great wisdom, no longer questions its own grounds and can only accept its own capture in the spectacle of its disappearance? This disappearance is that idea of, oh, the social is going away. It's that collective ambiguity and dissatisfaction with, oh, I'm never being represented. And this, for Baudrillard, is not the triumph of power, but this is the result of the triumph of the object, which leaves us with a brute objectivity where the real and the unreal, there is no distinction there anymore. It's a question of producing truth, of circularity, which yields to us pure objects. And the pure object is an important concept to go along with this kind of triumph of the object. Baudrillard says the masses are pure object, that which has vanished from the horizon of the subject, that which has disappeared from the horizon of history. And the pure object is really a copy without an original. It has resulted from an insistence on objectivity of reference, which essentially operates backwards on oneself, folds one in on oneself like a black hole, like he mentioned in the first chapter, and creates a self-referential system where our activities of production lead back to ourselves and reproduce a form. But never fear, there is hope here. Baudrillard says anything that was once constituted as an object by a subject represents for the latter a virtual death threat. No more than the slave accepts his servitude does the object accept its compulsory objectivity. The subject can attain only an imaginary mastery of it, ephemeral to all events, but will not escape this insurrection of the object, a silent revolution, but the only one left now. This revolution will not be symbolic, dazzling and subjective, but obscure and ironic. It won't be dialectical. It will be fatal. Against the seduction of every object stripped of its sense, against the possibility for any object to be an object of seduction and dread, any strategy will be a good one. So there's a fatality in objects themselves which threaten one. We can think, for example, of, the earth is a very fatal object. It's something that we master more and more every day. But by mastering it more and more, we only increase its fatal potential because the object doesn't accept its compulsory objectivity. A great example of this is today there's a problem of forest fires as a result of global warming, and as a response to this, a lot of companies and a lot of park services were putting out certain forest fires. Just you see a forest fire and you put it out. But what actually happened is it ended up totally increasing the likelihood that future and much more catastrophic forest fires would occur, because those forest fires were actually a natural product of really a duplicity of nature, of the propensity for change. And what it did is it allowed for this burnt carbon from the trees to seep into the soil and to rejuvenate the soil and provide a more rich nutrient source for trees to grow stronger, for their root structures to be maintained, and also to help ensure that moisture could stay in the environment. It's kind of weird, huh? The very act of forest fires was naturally controlled to maximize water in the soil. So when these forest fires were being put out, what actually happened is soil quality was decreasing, it wasn't able to hold as much water, and the environment got drier and drier, and this led to even worse, more prevalent forest fires. So by trying to rule the object, in this sense, nature as an object, and putting it into this compulsory objectivity, it answers back with a death threat. It answers back with a fatal strategy. And thus, when we, for example, strip nature of its sense and we turn it into a question of logging, of abstract extraction of value, we actually just make it all the more fatal, which is precisely the sort of triumph of the object, the genie of the object per se, which is something Baudrillard is interested in. And when it comes to the unconscious, Baudrillard makes a couple of interesting qualifications on a number of psychoanalytic, obviously psychoanalysis has this conception of the unconscious, which is exactly what Baudrillard is trying to fight against, this notion of the true self that has been repressed. Baudrillard says, but perhaps our true unconscious is in this ironic power of withdrawal, of non-desire, non-knowledge, silence, absorption, then expulsion of all powers, wills, of all enlightenment and depths of meaning, because of an insistence which is thereby bathed in the light of a ridiculous-looking halo. Our unconscious might not be composed of desires properly sworn to the sad destiny of repression. It might not even be repressed at all. It would instead be made up out of what's left after this joyous expulsion of all encumbering superstructures of being and will. He says, we always had a sad vision of the masses, alienated, a sad vision of the unconscious, repressed. Upon our entire philosophy lies the heavy weight of these sad correlations. If only for the sake of change, it would be interesting to conceive of the masses, the object masses, as possessing a delusive, elusive, allusive strategy, corresponding to an unconscious that is finally ironic, joyous, and seductive. And really, to me, this is Baudrillard's fröhliche Wissenschaft, gay science, as Nietzsche calls it. It's Nietzsche's God who he wishes could dance, from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It is an irony and a seduction which allows for a sort of loftiness and light tiptoeing of the subject that is going to undergo change. And when we get into this last evil genie of passion, he's basically talking about love versus seduction. And for Baudrillard, love is a model to be followed. And I really think a good way to think about love versus seduction for Baudrillard is to think about mapping versus tracing for Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari say that tracing is following some pre-made model, right? You're tracing over something that already exists, and it's reproductive. But mapping is an active process of making a new map, of drawing your own lines of flight, so to speak. Now, I understand that Baudrillard is basically using in the exact opposite sense of, for Baudrillard, maps would be following a model, whereas irony, seduction, this would be drawing your own lines of flight. But it's the same kind of idea, where love is basically following a pre-made model of love as fulfillment of my true desires, quote unquote, of love as freeing me to some sort of thing that I couldn't be without some other person, which is a rather toxic way of thinking about love, because then it turns into dependency, which is exactly what Baudrillard is pointing out, is we have a dependency on information as our object of love, and it becomes obscene in that act. So love is really, it's like a form, like Plato's forms. It's an abstraction which becomes a phantasm when treated as some universal unifier. It always is the kind of thing that never seems to, oh, there's always some sort of conflict, or, oh, we haven't reached our final idealized state, and then you just die, and that's it. And really, that's not a good way of thinking about things for Baudrillard. He contrasts love, which for him, love is so romanticized today that it is idealistic, right? We take our date ideas from media, from reproducing the models that everyone else has made that seem to spring out of nowhere, fads, trends. As opposed to this, he points to a sort of seduction, which he says a little bit conservatively that, we used to have seduction, that we used to have seduction as fate, and there was this sort of ambiguity of love. It wasn't always just for the purpose of, some sort of narcissistic purpose. Maybe a little bit unfounded, maybe a little bit of a stretch, but nevertheless, the point stands when he says seduction is linked not to affects, but to the fragility of appearance. It has no model and seeks no form of salvation. It is therefore immoral. It obeys no morality of exchange. It is based rather on the pact, the challenge, and the alliance, which are not universal and natural forms, but artificial and initiatory ones. It is therefore frankly perverse. And this is perverse in a good way. This is some nomadic, fleeting, productive interaction with someone where really a game is the best way to think about it. That games have these rules which, you think about who created chess first or who created checkers first. They kind of had to create this game through tinkering, through, how does this action, does it run into any contradictions that ruin the way we can play the game in all cases, or how does this work? And maybe we get in kind of particular double bind situations where, just the rules of the game when it was created, it didn't account for this, and we don't really know what to do here. And that is precisely what Baudrillard wants to point out, that is still there. That ambiguity, that lack of coding, that is a better way to think about reality as a game for Baudrillard. And that it is based on not universal or natural forms, but something artificial, something we created. And that doesn't make it any less real for being created. Because really, what we consider to be real is caricatured in like The Bachelor, for example, or these sort of petrified notions of true love we see in the media, which they're realer than real insofar as, they're hyper real, they influence the way we interact. But we all know they're fake. We all know they're not real. We all know for like Instagram models that that's not always how they are, for example. But at the same time, it doesn't make it any less real for being a media spectacle, whether it's love or whether it's modeling or whatever it may be. And Baudrillard points out that if we view love in the right way, it can be something seductive as long as we treat it as something which is not a pre-made model. He says love is fulfillment, and fulfillment is the kind of thing that's the sort of, I have something I need, that I desire, that I don't have, that will make me complete. He says love is fulfillment only if you think of it, say, narcissistically. I love the other because he is like me, therefore I duplicate myself. I love the other because he is my opposite, therefore I complete myself. However, one can conceive of love as gratuitous, as an élan towards the other that expects no answer, as a challenge that excites the other to love me more than I love him, therefore as a perpetually higher bid. So, right, we have these narcissistic tendencies to think of, I love someone because they share all my qualities. They're so similar to me. Yet also we have this, they complete me. I would be nothing without them. And obviously, both of those essentially fulfillment modes of love aren't very useful. This is the kind of thing Nietzsche hated in the traditional conceptions of marriage, which is that it's this sort of idealized, romanticized stasis. It's self-serving in its universality almost. So instead, Baudrillard wants us to look for challenge, for ecstatic duels, for becoming in the broadest sense, in a challenge that can't be met except with some sort of ambiguous response, which is properly exciting, of course. And I did want to just highlight, I'm not going to go into it too much because frankly I'm still a little confused about it, but pataphysics is an important element of Baudrillard's philosophy. That it's not about metaphysics for Baudrillard, about figuring out what the real is versus the imaginary, because of course that for Baudrillard is deeply problematic. He would see that as being infused with a lot of assumptions that in fact are almost counterproductive. So instead, Baudrillard opts for pataphysics, which is the science not of reality, but of imaginary solutions. It's a sort of creative, and for him, an ironic, satirical way of looking at theory. It's, what does he call it, a comical theory instead of an infinitely critical theory, I think is what he says. But a good definition of pataphysics, this is on page 133 of the semiotext edition for anyone who just wants to know. Cruel, rigorous forms of the sign in its pure functioning, opposed to the reality of the world. So it's not about a reality principle. It's about a function. It's about what can this do? What kind of becomings can this incite, so to speak? And I think that can be creative at times. I think, Baudrillard is not saying that pragmatics is not important, that, how does this theory relate to society? In fact, Baudrillard is deeply concerned with the relation to society. So he's not trying to alienate himself and kind of go into a purely theoretical sort of philosophy. No, he's merely pointing out that there are some assumptions with the word real, just like there are with ideas of rational. How, for example, the idea of rationality can be used against women or black people to deny them representation. And for Baudrillard, it is much more effective to go from this functionalist perspective. And going off of this, he wants to point out, I mentioned earlier this sort of empty universality, almost. It is, love becomes self-serving in its universality. Baudrillard says the distinctive quality of a universal passion like love is that it is individual and that everyone finds himself alone in it. And this is really an isolated individuality that comes from universals, which Baudrillard makes explicitly clear. Universals are abstractions. They are hyper-realities. They are the motor behind those forces of society which essentially operate as an apparatus of capture, to use Deleuze and Guattari's terms, that essentially functions by reducing reality to hyper-reality, which is to say a procession of models. And with this idea of universality, it's not too dissimilar from Foucault's when he's talking about the panopticon, about this circular prison in which visibility is maximized, that it's as if individuality maximizes to the point that no one has their own body or is their own subject, but rather is subjectified to an apparatus of knowledge production, which serves to discipline them and turn them into some idealized form, that serves to correct them. And in this sense, there's really the same thing that Baudrillard is talking about with the sort of excessive emphasis on pure information turns reality itself into a mobilizable code that you can kind of fit in wherever it fits. He says, to love someone is to isolate him from the world, wipe out every trace of him, dispossess him of his shadow, drag him into a murderous future. It is to circle around the other like a dead star and absorb him into a black light. Everything is gambled on an exorbitant demand for the exclusivity of a human being, whoever it may be. This is doubtless what makes it a passion. Its object is interiorized as an ideal end, and we know that the only ideal object is a dead one. So when love assumes this notion of an idealized, fulfilled subject, we really enter this maximum mode of subjectification where we become circled by, oh, you have to be some way, you have to be accountable to some sort of identity, for example. And one thing that I think is important to point out is Baudrillard loves the ambiguity of the object, that it resists totalization, in effect. But he's not trying to make a fuzzy aggregate, as Deleuze and Guattari put it. He's not trying to use some weasel word to say, oh, we can just never figure stuff out. No, he's actually propping up this ambiguity as something whose job it is to be turned into something new, to be productive with instead of reproductive with, to accentuate some sort of action. He says, seduction is not mysterious, it is enigmatic. The enigma, like the secret, is not unintelligible. It is, on the contrary, fully intelligible, but it cannot be said or revealed. Such is seduction. Inexplicable evidence. Such is the game. At the heart of any game is a fundamental secret rule, an enigma. Nevertheless, the whole process is no mystery. Nothing is more intelligible than a game in progress. Right? So we're merely bringing out ineffability, not unintelligibility. This is not some pure fluid state of, oh, there are no rules, because that would be an abstraction. No, there are parameters, there are rules. In fact, Baudrillard points out throughout this chapter the importance of rules when going about our fatal strategies. But what happens is we're denying the notion that everything can be put in linguistic, logical, rational terms. That everything has to be explicable. things can be intelligible. We can affectively interact with something. But we don't have to make it accountable to some sort of full visibility. This game in progress that he speaks of is exactly what I mentioned before. That there's a real creativity that's involved in constructing a game, which can be seen as both creating new rules and also creating an apparatus of capture, in a sense, of tying down rules or ways of being. But because there's always a little bit that is exposed, that is precisely the excitement. And Baudrillard says this is probably the most explicit mention of this lack of a reality behind something, and that being a good thing. He says plainly, this is on page 138, there is nothing to reveal. Right? It's not about revealing things. It's about seducing something into movement through ambiguity. Through adding to that doesn't add up, as Homi Bhabha puts it. Baudrillard says, from where could there have originated the crazy idea of revealing the secret, exposing the bare substance, touching radical obscenity? That in itself is a utopia. There is no real. There never was a real. Seduction knows this and preserves its enigma. All other forms, and love in particular, are gossipy and prolix. They say too much. They want to say too much. Love talks a lot. It's a discourse. It declares itself and culminates often in this declaration where it is at its end. Highly ambiguous act of language, almost indecent. These things aren't said. How can you say to someone, I love you? They appear too fragile to be wrapped in an enunciation unless that is the only life they really have, in which case they are no longer secret at all. These things live only in their silence or in their denial. I don't love you at all, or even I won't see you anymore. Phrases still weighted with the challenge and suspense of seduction, imminence of love, but which still maintain, by the grace of denial, a quality of game, a lightness of lure. So really, sociality is best viewed as a game. It's not universal. There's not some sort of category of, oh, I love you means one particular thing. I mean, think about the subtleties in which tone can change I love you into something calming that you say to your partner before you go to bed versus something excitatory that leads to sexual acts, for example. So it's not a question of liberation of desire or liberation of secrets. It's a tinkering in the in-between of being content to be in that moment where things are yet to be decided. And this is everywhere. Baudrillard says all verbs have a secret mood beyond the indicative and imperative, the seductive. Seduction is a modality of all discourse, which is to say, seduction is always a possibility. Seductive is treating language with, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it, a sober gesture. It is making language stutter rather than stuttering in speech, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it. It's working on those interstices and understanding that oftentimes not saying something says something. And that precisely by not insisting on enunciation, on this accountability to the reality principle, to truth, to identity, in fact, we can keep some of that vitality in life that makes it so ironic, as Baudrillard puts it. So I hope this has been helpful in looking at Baudrillard's philosophy. I think this chapter is particularly important for getting a sense of what he means by objects and pure objects, and getting a little bit more into some of the ways out, so to speak, even that's an inadequate term, but ways of functioning that aren't totalizable, that aren't reducible to enunciation. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on this work of Baudrillard's. I do other stuff of Baudrillard. I have stuff on postmodernism, feminism, German idealism. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.